Welcome back, and we've been talking about GDP, which is the aggregate measure of production or income in a place, usually a country. Uh, and we've been talking about how it might be used to measure living standards. But this is not the whole picture, because GDP doesn't control for things like population or price levels. And so a better measure of GDP might be per capita or per person GDP. And to calculate this, and I know we haven't learned how to calculate GDP yet, we'll punt on that for a second, but to calculate per capita GDP, we just take the GDP and divide it by the population. And this gets you not just a measure of living standards, but a blunt, again, measure of average living standards in the country. And take a minute to think to yourself whether or not this seems right, to compare things in this per capita way. And think about comparing, say, something like the UK to Iran. The fact that we look at things from a per capita perspective suggests that there are going to be many differences among countries not fully captured in GDP. So let's take a look at this by looking at this graph. And what this graph does is compare the GDP of each state. Granted, these data are a little old, they're from 2017, but they compare the data of each state to countries with comparable GDP. So by way of comparison, Virginia, our state, has a GDP of about $435 billion. We produce $435 billion worth of goods and services each year. Here it says Thailand, but I like to compare us to Poland, which is, comparable to North Carolina as well. So you can look these data up on your own, but Poland has a GDP of $471 billion. So Virginia and Poland are pretty comparable in terms of their measures of production. But we need a little bit more to measure living standards. Remember, we need to take into account the population. So Virginia's population is about 8.5 million people. Whereas Poland's population is about 40 million people. So even though Poland has slightly higher GDP than us, but still comparable, our GDP, Virginia's GDP, is about 4.5 times greater, I should say GDP per capita, 4.5 times greater than Poland per capita GDP. And think to yourself, think about what you know about living here in Virginia and what you might know about living in Poland, and think about average living standards and see if this account jives with you. So now that we have an idea of how we use these data, let's take a look and think about what these data actually amount to. And in particular, let's go ahead and define this thing we've been talking about for a couple slides. What is GDP, or gross domestic product? And gross domestic product has a very precise definition. It is the market value of all final goods and services produced in a nation over a specific period of time. And that period of time is typically 1 year. And what we're going to do for the next couple of slides is go over what each of these words mean in context. Like I said, this definition is incredibly precise because it tells us not just what is in GDP, but also what isn't in GDP. And what this gets is a measure of national output, GDP, also a measure of national income. And it, like I said, it guides us in figuring out not only what it is, but also it's not included in GDP. And there's a specific reason for this. And what that reason is it prevents the double counting of anything. So first, how do we measure the value of production. So GDP is the market value of all final goods and services produced within a nation over a specific period of time. Now let's first look at market value, which is an aggregate number. It combines the production of everything an economy produces, not only goods, tangible goods like food and clothing and cars, but also services like haircuts and healthcare and entertainment. And the way we measure market value is expenditures on production or income earned from production. And what this looks like in practice is something that's known as the final price method. So what do we produce at Sweetbriar? Well, we produce horses, we raise horses, and we produce honey, jars of honey. And market value in this context is just price times quantity. So, why do we use market value? Why do we use the final price to calculate market value? Because it gives us this apples to apples comparison. So Sweetbriar produces both horses and honey. And you'll notice that in this trivial and made up example, we make a lot more jars of honey than we do raise horses. But a horse is much more valuable than a jar of honey. So our market value of horses, to get that market value, again, multiply price times quantity. Our market value of horses, in this case, is $1,700, where our market value of honey is only $162. To calculate Sweetbriar's GDP, we add those two things together, and we get $1,862. And what this gets us is this final price market value method, and it's important because it tells us not only how much we're producing, but also the relative importance of how much we're producing. And in this case, horses make up about 95% of this made-up economy I made for Sweetbriar. GDP is the market value of all final goods and services. And final meaning they are done being used in production. They're the goods that are sold to the end user, the consumer. This is different from an intermediate good, which is still used in production. Think about steel before it becomes a building. So why do we only include final goods and services and not intermediate goods and services? Certainly the economy is producing intermediate goods and services. These things are an important measure of the economy. But we only include final goods to prevent double counting. And what makes a good a final good is how it is used and not the good itself. So we might see something that is used productively, but we count as a final good. So let's think about, say, gasoline. There are several steps in gasoline production. And at each one of these steps, the price reflects what has been spent on producing that product so far. So to get gas into your car, we need to drill oil out of the ground. We need to refine oil into gasoline. We need to ship oil from the refinery to the gas station. And finally, that gas station needs to store it and sell it to you in a retail market. And you'll note that along the way, the price goes up to reflect these additional steps. So, on your own, fill out the blanks, and then we'll come back next lecture and talk about how this has been added to production.